First thing I want to do is start out by adding regular terrain to our scene. And since we're mostly focusing on our ecosystems, we don't really need to worry about having the detail of a procedural terrain just yet. We could always go ahead and convert that to a procedural terrain once we're done working with this. But what I'm going to do is double click on our terrain to open up our terrain editor. And I'm just going to click the ×2 up in the top. What that's going to do is change this to a 512 by 512. And that's 512 by 512 pixels, and that way we're working with a little bit higher resolution, and we don't have any of those major polygons showing up in there. Now there are several different ways we can work on ecosystems within Vue. We have the painting technique, and then of course our material editing technique. And those can also be linked together, which you'll see in just a little bit. But first, let's go ahead and just take a look at our ability to paint ecosystems, which is actually very, very cool. And it's actually quite easy once you understand the way the settings work. So I'm just going to go ahead and reposition our view a little bit. And the main thing we want to focus on right now is our top view, because our top view is what we're going to be painting in. So we want to make sure that we have our top view open. And of course, it's also good to have your other views open as well, so that you can see exactly where everything is at and the way all the positions are going to be set up. So let's go ahead up to the top, and we can see just in our display we have our little painting icon with a tree next to it. So let's go ahead and click on that. And this is going to bring up our ecosystem painter. Now immediately what we see is that we have an X on the screen, and that is because we do not have an ecosystem population added. In other words, there's nothing to paint. So I'm going to go ahead and click Add, and this will give us the ability to add a rock, plant, or an object. So we can select any of these three types of objects to add to our scene. I'm going to go ahead and just select rock right away. And immediately we're going to see, would you like color variations to be applied to the rocks? And once this is created, these variations can't be removed. So this is important. Do we want our rocks to be varied in color, or do we want them to be all one material? So what we can do is just go ahead and I'm going to click No. And in this case, what we're going to have is just a regular rock of one color. And then what we can do is actually adjust our color right here. So click on that, and I'm going to make this more of a gray rock. So go ahead and bring this down. We have sort of a grayish green texture right now. And I'm going to click OK. And now we can select a couple of different options if we take a look at Tool. What we have is a single instance, which what that's going to do is just paint one individual rock in this case. And what we have below that is our brush setting, and we can see that when we move the cursor over to the top view, we can actually see the red circle that represents our brush. If I go back to the single instance and we go to our top view, even though we have a little bit of an error right here where we can see the previous brush tool, all we can really see is our cursor. So if I go ahead and just click in here, we can see that it's creating randomly shaped rocks based on that color that we have selected. And even with this selected, what we can do is change our scale. I'm going to go ahead and change this up to about 2.5. And now we have some larger rocks being created. Now if at any point we want to get rid of what we've created, we can either undo, but depending on how much system resources you have or how much RAM you have, you might not be able to undo everything you've done. So we can go to the eraser option, and what we have is the same settings as before, brush radius, and we can also adjust our brush flow of this. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete these rocks in here. So we can just brush those in, which makes it pretty easy. Go back to our brush setting, and we're going to take a look at what we can see is we have a brush radius, so our overall radius of our brush, and our brush flow, which allows basically the density. I'm going to go ahead and change this down to 9% and reduce our brush radius. I'm just going to paint some rocks in there. And we can see that overall it's not very dense. Go ahead and undo that. We're going to change our brush flow to something a little bit higher. And if we paint in here, we can see it creates a lot more instances. So that's pretty straightforward. I'm going to change that down to about 50%. And then what we also have on the bottom is our scale, just like we had before, even with the single instance. So we can adjust our overall scale as well. And then our color once again. Now on the right, what you'll see is we have these little arrows on the right. And what these are is our ability to drive these different settings with pressure. If you don't have a tablet or a pressure-sensitive device, then you really don't need to worry about these. And then pretty much you'll be using a constant rate. In other words, what we have is 34. It will be set to 34 constantly. So if we set our brush radius to drive with pressure, then the lower amount of pressure will create a smaller radius, and a large amount of pressure on the tablet would create a larger radius. This works with brush flow and scale as well. We could either drive all those together or individually. I also note that if you are using a tablet, you want to make sure you have the properties open, at least for Wacom tablets, before you open View. So if you open up the Properties panel and then open View, then you'll have no problems with it working. Otherwise, if you don't have those options and the properties open for that device, it may not work and may not respond within View. So just something to keep in mind. If we take a look at the bottom here, what we also have is a limit density. And what this allows us to do is to limit our density. Of course, pretty straightforward. So if I can reduce this down to 50, then our density is not going to go above 50. And that's pretty straightforward, and most of these settings really are, and they don't really require a whole lot of explanation. And next to limit density, we have a little button for over max density. In other words, if this is selected, once we reach our density of 50, our objects will start to swell rather than there being more objects created within that amount. So in other words, we won't have a huge cluster of objects. They'll just start to get a little bit bigger. So you can either turn that on or off depending on what you want. And if we go back up to the top too, if you notice under brush, we have an Airbrush Style. And what this means is if we leave the mouse constantly clicked in the area, or the pen constantly pressing down on the tablet, what will happen is we will continually create instances. Now if Airbrush Style is off, that won't happen. So just like using an airbrush, and just like it works in most painting programs, it's fairly straightforward. If we have, I'm just going to go ahead and show this a little bit more. If I go ahead and paint some of these rocks on here, and then I select our object and click Remove, it's actually going to remove all of them from our terrain in this case. So if you want to keep what you've created in your scene, make sure you do not remove them from your population, because everything will stack onto each other. You don't need to worry about removing anything before you select new object. So I'm going to go ahead and just add a plant now. Something we can just play around with a little here, and show some options. And what I'm just going to do is turn off all of our online content right now by going down here and just clicking on this little button. And what I'm going to do is just select our fir tree to start out with and click OK. Now we have our brush setting on. I'm going to go ahead and turn down our brush radius and reduce our brush flow so that we're not creating high levels of density. I'm also going to turn off limit density. And what we want to do is adjust our scale. And by doing that, we're just going to go ahead and paint in and take a look and see if that's a scale we want. If we want something a little bit bigger, we can just undo that. Another way to test that is just do a single instance first, because our scale will bounce back and forth between the two settings. So if I go to single instance and we raise our setting up to about 2.5, and I go ahead and just click in there, we can get a good idea of the size of just one instance, and that way we're not creating a large amount of them that are maybe too large or too small. So I can undo that. We can make that a little bit bigger. Paint that in there just by clicking. And now if this is the size we want, we can go to the brush and we can see that that scale has carried over from the single instance. So that value stays the same no matter what we're using, single instance or brush. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. We're going to reduce our scale. And I'm just going to go ahead and type in 2. We're going to go back to our brush. And now we can just start painting in some of our objects. Now in this case what I have is just a small display error, and what's happening is it's just showing dots for our ecosystems and our instances that are being added, and then refreshing to our objects right away. So depending on system speed and of course compatibility with video cards, you might see different variations while you're painting. So right now we can see we're just back to those dots, and then if I let go, it refreshes. And a lot of those settings also, if we go up to File and Options, have to do with what we have set up for our instant draw and background draw, and then plant instant draw and background draw. And if your system can't handle the highest values, most of you won't be able to set these up all the way. So if you need to increase performance, what you can do is just kind of drag all of these down just a little bit further, and then you'll see a little bit more of increased performance. Okay, so now what we can also do, I'm going to go ahead and change our color. I'm going to set this to an orange and just paint in here with our fir tree still. And now we can see what we've created is orange colored fir trees. And we're just going to take a look at our preview. And we can see those plants all coming up, and we have different variations between that. So what we can also do is change that to a different color if we wanted to. And I'll just change that to something a little more interesting. Blue that's really going to stand out. And we're just going to take a look at the preview on the right. And we can see that refresh. And we have all of these different blue objects in there now. So that's pretty neat that we can control all of that based on just one little setting. And then you can also see that we still have our original color of our tree in there. So if we want to, we can just change that back. And maybe adjust that color back to the way it was. I'm just going to undo this, or in this case I could just clear, which will remove all of our instances that we've painted. And I'm going to go to our color and scaling tool. Now this is a tool you want to use once we already have instances. So I'm going to go back to our brush, and we're just going to paint in, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to change the color down, trees that are a little more dormant. Increase our brush radius and just kind of paint in a few of our trees here. And now if we go to our color and scaling, we can either turn on one or the other. So if I just want to be working on the color, I can turn off scaling, and we can change our color. So in this case, what I'm going to do is, let's get more of a yellow, sort of deadish looking tree. So more of a brown color, and click OK. And now what we can do is just color in these instances by going over them with our brush. And in this case, since we can only see a few trees, we can tell by the color of our dots that represent our instances that currently aren't showing up as we're painting. We can see those changing their color. So it's a very helpful guide. And we'll take a look and let that refresh. So now we can see we have our green fir trees along with the outer edges sort of changing to more of dormant or dead trees. Now what we can also do is go ahead and uncheck our coloring, and I'm going to turn on scaling. Now what this is going to allow us to do is adjust our scale. So as we move over our different instances, we'll go ahead and increase that value if we want. We can see that we're enlarging our different trees. And the longer we hold down our brush on those individual instances in those trees, we can see them increase in size. And then this value, of course, adjusts the overall effect. We can go ahead and turn that up all the way, and we can notice that it's a lot more sensitive, so the less time we leave it there, it's getting a lot bigger. If we go ahead and turn that down to a lower value, then it's going to take a while for us to actually reduce these trees. And which also means we can just scale them down a little bit. And once we reach those specific values as sort of a fixed number, so let's go ahead and type in 1, and we're just going to scale these down. And now we can also use these together. So I could turn on coloring along with scaling. So that way if I wanted to make some larger trees, and I want those larger trees to maybe be a more intense green, or if I wanted to make some trees smaller and I wanted them to be more of a lighter green or a different color, maybe a plant you're working on is purple when it's small, and as it grows it maybe turns to more of a greenish color, or vice versa. This way you could achieve that effect quite easily without really having to worry about going in there and manually setting each number. So this way we can control both coloring and scaling at the same time. What we can also do is adjust that dry with pressure. So we can do that. We adjust our radius, and we could drive that with pressure if we wanted, or we could do each of these individual ones. And if we also go up and take a look at the top of our ecosystem painter, we can see that we have 259 instances. So this will keep track of exactly how many plants or objects you have painted within your scene, and that way it can be a little bit easier to control numbers, and it gives you a better idea of what you're working with. What we're also going to take a look at now is our display options, and I'm just going to go ahead and double click on our main camera view to increase that to full size. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here, and I'm going to go to our display options. Now in this setting, what we can do is change the way we want to view, in this case, our trees. So Billboard is our default, and what Billboard is just two-dimensional planes that are connected together, that we can sort of see that within our scene. And in some cases there might be more, but it's just a representation, and it's not actually the polygons of our scene. Even though we can see that in the bottom right corner of our screen we have over 3 million polygons, they're not actually being displayed in our scene, or at least not in our viewports. As we render, we can see those polygons, but not actually see them. So we can go through all of these different options. In order to actually see these different polygons, we can go through flat shaded and smooth shaded. Now these are high intensity, very memory hungry settings. So if you have a lot of instances in your scene, I would not suggest using these settings. I'm going to go ahead and change this to smooth shaded right now, and we can see that our scene will refresh, and now we can see the full polygon resolution of all of these different trees. Like I said, if you're working with a very large scene, lots of different instances, this could possibly slow down your computer and get to the point where maybe it crashes. So it's one thing to definitely pay attention to. Although in most cases, if it is beyond the amount that your computer can handle, what will actually happen is, in most cases, you'll see just boxes representing the instances rather than the trees. So what I'm going to do now is just set this back to a different, we can go ahead and change that to flat shaded if we wanted. And that's going to be a little less of a memory hog as the smooth shaded. But we can also do wireframe, and we'll just let that refresh. And now we can see a wireframe of our different objects. Change that to a filled box. And these are the boxes that you'll end up seeing if your system can't handle displaying that full resolution outside of the Billboard setting. So we can take a look at wireframe box as well. And then we can also change that back to Billboard or even none. Now what I would mostly suggest is using Billboard with full quality near camera. Now what full quality near camera is is a region around our camera that only shows just our full quality, and everything beyond that is going to be Billboard. So as I move our camera back, we'll go ahead and close that just for right now so that we can move our camera. I'm just going to move back, and now we can see that only this front tree is full quality, and the rest of it is all Billboard. And that's because that's just our region where our camera is letting out. And the top view is a little bit better representation of this. I'm just going to go ahead and zoom in a little so we can see just a few more trees at full quality. Maybe a little bit further. And now we can see that we sort of have this circle area around our camera view. And all of that, anything within that area is of course going to be full quality. So that way you can focus mainly on what's immediately in front of you and not so much the whole scene. And you can be a little more precise about it. We can also adjust that value. By default it's set to 200. And it really depends on the size of your actual scene, or the size of your terrains, or whether or not you're working in real scale or not. So that value can really depend on what it is you're working on and how you work within View. I'm going to go ahead and just turn that off right now, so we're working with just our instances. And let's go ahead and just clear that out. And I'm also going to go back to our brush, and we're just going to paint a couple of different layers. So we'll just do our fir trees in certain areas, and then I'm going to go ahead and click Add, select Plant, and now we could add something else to our scene. So we could let's add our large dead tree. And let's say I want these to be smaller than our fir tree, so I can just reduce our scale and go in here and just paint in. And now what we can see happen is that these trees are huge, a lot larger than they should be. But that's only because every single plant has its own size variation. So if I go ahead and just undo that, we're going to go back to our single instance. We need to find out what value is going to be good to match up these different plants to each other. So let's go ahead and just click in there. And now we can see that we have a pretty good scale. So 0.36 seems to be a good relation to what we had before, which is up in the ones for creating our fir trees. So you have to vary it back and forth between different plants and different objects because they all have a different value of what a scale of 1 is, because it's all based on the original scale of that plant. So they might not necessarily be exactly the same. So it's definitely something to pay attention to. And it's also something to pay attention to with objects and not just plants and rocks as well. So that's why adding a single instance before you go ahead and paint and adjust that scale appropriately can be very important, making sure that you get the right size that you need. So let's go ahead and just paint a few of those dead trees in there. And now we just have that area where we have dead trees on the more on the inside and our fir trees on the outside. So I'm just going to go ahead and close out our ecosystem painter right now. And now we're going to take a look at one of the ways we can edit these instances. Next to our painting panel, we have our editing. So it's our ecosystem selector. We're just going to pull up this panel. And what we can see is we have 917 instances, 0 selected out of that. We can adjust our brush radius for this. We can also drive that with pressure. And what this tool is going to allow us to do is just, in this case, under Tool, we have Select on. So as we start doing the same action as we were doing before, just clicking as we were painting, right now we're selecting our ecosystem and selecting our instances. We can also select that to change that tool to deselect and go ahead and deselect those instances. Now next to Tool, we notice that we have selections. With this option, what we can do is go ahead and save our selections that we have. So right now we have all of these objects selected. I can go ahead and click Save. And now we have a new slot. So right now what we have is 142 selected instances saved. So that way if we want to go back, so right now what we can do is go ahead and deselect certain areas, and we could select something else if we wanted. Or if you just got a part done and you wanted to save that, you can go ahead and do that right away. And right now we can see that the save is grayed out. And what we could do is just load that in if we wanted to, or we can go ahead and select a new group. We can go ahead and click Save. And these are just going to keep stacking up on top of each other. So what I can do is now deselect all of our different areas. Or we could just go ahead and up to the top, select None, or select All. And this way we can create groups of selections. Go ahead and save that. And now we're going to select None. And now at any time if we want to, we can bring up any of these different selections that we have. So let's go ahead and load the first one. And now we have that first selection, so I can select None. And then we can load up that second layer we created. Plus we could also load up the first. Or we could load up the third. And it will just switch between all of our different settings. What we can also do is just go ahead and discard them. And now these slots are empty. And once we fill them up, they'll stack up quite a bit so that we can create lots of different selections. And now I'm going to just select None right now. I'm going to create a new selection, just grab some of these in the center. And if we go to Manipulate, we can see we have a couple of different options here. We can convert these to objects if we want, and that way we can edit them as if they were objects within that we added individually. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that now. We can just convert that to objects. And we're going to notice in the layer panel that all of these new trees are going to come up in here, and we also have a new group that we can edit. So we can see that we have all of our different trees added in here. And we can see that all of our objects are all still selected, although if we wanted to, we could individually select these objects. And we could make maybe one tree a little bit larger than another. And right now we just have this one tree selected. So if I wanted to, I could scale this one. So we could select our scaling option. And that way we could just scale this one specific tree. Or we can go back and we can select groups of these trees. Although it's a really good idea before you convert these instances to objects to know exactly what it is you want to edit, what you want to do them. And that way you don't have to create a whole bunch of these different objects in your scene if you're not actually going to be manipulating them. So what I want to do now is just go ahead and reselect all of these trees that we've turned into objects. And now I'm just going to right mouse click in one of our viewports, and we can select Revert to Instances. And that's going to change all of these back into our instances. And that way they're no longer separate objects, and you can see they've all been cleared out from our layer panel. We're going to go back up to our ecosystem selector. We're going to take a look at some of our other manipulation options. Let's go ahead and select a few of these objects. Go back to Manipulate. And if we select Move Instances To, and right now we have Global Ecosystem, because right now that's all we have in our scene is our global ecosystem. And what the global ecosystem is anything we paint in the scene. We have a material-based ecosystem and the global ecosystem. So right now we really can't change this to anything else, but if we had a material ecosystem in our scene, we would see those options come up, and we can move that to that specific material. And we'll get back to that a little bit later. What we can also do is change our instance types. So let's say we have an area selected that's different sorts of trees. Right now we have our fir trees and our large dead trees. And if we have both of them selected, we can change all the selections to one specific type. So if we want to select a region that has maybe some random trees in there that shouldn't be there, we can go ahead and change that to a different type of tree if we wanted to. And that's just by selecting what's already available and what we know is available because in the painting options and what's listed in our ecosystem population. And now I've just cleared out our current ecosystem, and we're going to take a look at another couple of options within the ecosystem painter. Now, right now we have two different objects in our population. And on the bottom, what we can see is we have paint what. And by default, we have a bit of everything. And now what that's actually going to do is add up all of these different options and different objects that we have. So right now, if I paint in our scene, we can see it's painting a little bit of each of these different materials. And in this case, that's something you may not want to do with these two different types of trees because we have that size variation. So that's something you want to make sure you test before you go ahead and use different types of materials together. Because in this case, these large dead trees are actually quite large. And if we go back down to our area on the bottom, I'm just going to go ahead and undo that. We can select only selected items. So that way, we can only paint what it is we have selected. So we can paint just the large dead trees or just the fir trees, which is kind of neat. So go ahead and clear that out. And if we want to paint to only specific objects, we have an option on top that is restrict to selected objects. So if we select that option, then what will happen is, in this case, because our terrain is selected, it will only paint on our terrain, and we're not painting on our ground plane. But if I go ahead and turn that off, we can paint on our ground plane and our terrain. So lots of neat little tools that'll help you out in doing precisely what it is that you want to do with these different ecosystems and lay them out wherever it is you want to.